to testify today. I've submitted a written testimony that explains in a lot of detail the research that I've been doing over the last several years on this question of voter fraud, and I'd like to just take the few minutes that I have here to highlight a couple of points. One is the purpose of this research. As a political scientist, we study voting behavior, and the prevailing theories of voting suggest that, in fact, it may not even be rational to vote, let alone to vote twice. So when the rhetoric of fraud really got ramped up after the 2000 election, I thought it was an interesting puzzle. On the one hand, we were hearing lots and lots of stories of all kinds of fraud, of the system being very vulnerable to fraud, of there being an epidemic of voter fraud. And at the same time, the academic side, I had colleagues looking at me and asking, why are you studying this? There's very little academic research on it, and in fact, it doesn't make sense. The incentives have to be huge for an individual voter to commit fraud. In the absence of a conspiracy, there's no rationale for a voter to take the effort to commit a felony crime, vote twice, or to vote in the name of someone else. So it was an interesting puzzle. That's how I approached it. And I began by trying to look at the empirical record. And I want to address what I think are some mischaracterizations and misunderstandings about what that record shows. I want to focus specifically on the federal government's effort here to root out voter fraud. We heard the number 86 people. The research that I've been able to do, and it has been quite difficult actually to get the data from the Justice Department, but the research that I've done to look at the success of the Ballot Access and Voting Integrity Initiative, which the Justice Department began in 2001-2002, shows that between October 2002 and September 2005, there were only 40 voters indicted for any kind of a crime related to illegal voting. And I've supplied in the written testimony a table that shows for you a breakdown of the 95 indictments that the federal government brought under this program, which was to address voter fraud and voter intimidation. And when you dig into the data, because you have to dig into it, you find that only 40 of those people actually were voters. Others were government officials, campaign workers, election workers, and so forth. So looking at those 40 voters, there were 26 convictions or guilty pleas. That's a conviction rate of 65%, which is quite low for the Justice Department. When we look at those voters and those who were convicted, we see that one person was convicted for a registration fraud. That person did not even vote, and in fact, that man was deported back to Pakistan for registering to vote inadvertently when he went to redo his driver's license. There were 20 people who voted who were ineligible, and these were people who had felony convictions and had not had their civil rights restored, and also non-citizens, 15 of those. And then 5 people for multiple voting, and most of this occurred over the Kansas-Missouri border. So the record, the empirical record of the Justice Department here, where they have made a vigorous effort to root out voter fraud, has produced very, very little. And in my testimony, I mentioned other things that I've looked at. I've made an extensive search to try to look at state records here. I've used open records requests in the states to request data from every Attorney General, Secretary of State. I wrote letters to 2,700 district attorneys asking for data on this, and I'm convinced that there is no problem with individual voters trying to commit voter fraud. So this first point here is that we must look at data carefully, and we should look at what voters are doing, because one of the consequences of feeding what I think really has become a propaganda effort to convince the American public that voter fraud is a problem is that there's a lot of confusion about who's committing fraud and where the system is vulnerable, and it's worth taking the time to analyze that. The other point that I want to make, and to conclude quickly, is that contrary to what has been suggested here, there is no evidence that ID laws increase confidence in voting or increase voting. You can have an increase in turnout and you can suppress the vote at the same time. The question in Indiana is how much larger the turnout might have been had the photo ID law not been in place. So I'll conclude with that comment.